Hey there, everybody. I'm Dr. Pate, and welcome to Lifespan Development. We're going to be talking today about the first few chapters in your Lifespan Development text by Boyd and B. And as we go through the PowerPoints this semester, we're really just going to be hitting some of the highlights from the text. And so the idea is that you're going to read the entire chapters on your own, and we'll hit some of the highlights here, and some of your assignments will have you tap into some of the details in even a greater degree of depth. So some of those may be through discussion questions or essays. So as we get going here, we're going to hit some of the highlights. And if you have questions about anything, you're always welcome to give me a call during my office hours or shoot me an email about something. But we are going to jump in here and talk a little bit about the history of human development as a field of study, kind of where it comes from. And we'll talk about some primary theories or ways that we address human development or study it. And then we'll also take a look at research methods within human development. So that's what we're going to be talking about just in this first chapter here. And then we'll move on and talking about a couple other chapters as well. All right, so what is human development? Well, kind of at its core, human development is the scientific study, so through research, of age-related changes in behavior, thinking, emotion, and personality. And I will tell you that personality is one of the more vague things that we study in the field of psychology. So a lot of people have different definitions of what personality is and how it develops, how it changes, etc. So let's move ahead here and let's talk about some of the earlier theorists in human development. So first off, we've got some philosophical roots here, and St. Augustine of Hippo, was one of the first people to propose the idea of original sin. And so if you're of the Christian persuasion and you find yourself a believer in original sin, then you are of the understanding that people, ever since the fall, if we go all the way back to the garden and we say Adam and Eve committed sin, that this sinfulness is part of our DNA, in a sense, that it gets passed down from generation to generation in perpetuity. So all people for the rest of time will be born with original sin. And so Augustine said that humans are born selfish and must seek spiritual rebirth and religious training to try and overcome and work with this original sin. So to try and still be faithful to God as much as we can. And so in terms of what this might look like for people, essentially on a day-to-day basis, we have to struggle to overcome our innate immoral actions. A quick side note. So in terms of Adam and Eve and the garden and all that, I mean, there's a lot of debate within not only the Christian community, but just the world at large in terms of thinking, was the garden a real place? Were Adam and Eve real people? And genetics research actually has been able to show that there seems to be an original man and an original woman. And so they have genetic Adam, and they have what they call mitochondrial Eve being the original woman that we can trace back mitochondrial DNA through. And so when in your mitochondria, by the way, so different DNA for your general cell nuclei and your mitochondria. So a little fun fact here. So when we do genetic testing, sometimes that's done through mitochondrial DNA, and that actually has been traced back, scientists believe, to an original woman. And so they call that mitochondrial Eve. So kind of cool stuff there in terms of scientific evidence for Genesis being a legitimate actual story and not just a metaphorical study. So interesting stuff there coming out of genetics research. All right, so when we move on here from Augustine to our next theorist here, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he emphasized, instead of original sin, what he believed to be the basic goodness of human nature. So he would say that we're not born bad and selfish, but that we're born actually in more of a positive light, and that we need to be nurtured and protected, and that when we're bad, it's likely because our environment has interfered with us. So our environment has a lot to do with who we become as people. John Locke, on the other hand, was a proponent of the blank slate idea about people. So as infants, he would say, we are born as a blank slate, or this tabula rasa. So that we are, and that's where the empiricism comes in, that if you study a person and you look back through their life at the experiences they've had, the environmental impact shapes who they end up becoming. So it shapes their personality, it shapes how they develop. So any differences you might see between people would be due to their experiences. So one thing, and you'll notice that in our PowerPoint lectures here that I'll sometimes get off on a bit of a tangent talking about something integrative, and that's because it's something that's really important to me, and my sense and my experience has always been that the more that I study people, the more I study science, that the more it affirms my faith in God. So you'll see me get off on some tangents sometimes, but it's because it's something I'm passionate about, and I want you guys to also take that and to think about these things. And you may disagree with me on some things, and I certainly hope that you will, and that you won't just disagree, but that you'll think about why you disagree. So we'll put our thinking caps on together. So in terms of the Imago Dei, this idea that we're born as a blank slate, I see that as being something that doesn't line up with this idea that we're born with the image of God, that we have something about God that is built into us, so that we can say that we're born and made and created in the image of God. And so there's a lot of debate about what that really means, but I'm a believer that this image of God is not our looks, our physical looks. God is outside of space and time, but that God is a creator, that he is creative, and that creative essence is part of who we are as people. So something likely to do with our ability to be rational and creative, that we can think in terms of formal operations. We'll talk about Piaget later on, but that we can predict what might happen in situations. So those kinds of things I see as being the Imago Dei, and that's not something that really matches up with Locke's idea here, that we're born essentially with nothing, and that our environment shapes us into everything that we may end up being. All right, Darwin here, we're not going to get into his theory of evolution much here, but the idea is that when we observe people, we see that, yes, the environment has an important role in determining whom we grow up to be, but Darwin saw genetics at play here as well. So what he noted was that species may change and develop over time, and that this is likely due to the need to adapt to our situation. And so when we think about, how do we, if we're looking at someone and trying to study them over time, like Darwin detailed the records of his own children's early developmental history. So if we're studying a person, what we can see is that as their environment changes, they're going to adapt and change with that environment, or they'll get left behind, really. So that was a major contribution that Darwin made to the idea of human development, that we do adapt to our environment at an individual level, but then also at a broader species level, so that humankind has adapted over time to new environments. All right, Stanley Hall here. Really important for Hall here is that he emphasized norms. So the idea that you can compare a single person against something called a norm, or an average age at which something occurs. And so, if we're studying autism, and we'll get a chance to talk more about that later in the semester here, but when we think about autism, really there are some developmental milestones that are not hit that become the trigger for a psychologist, a parent, a school psychologist maybe, or a teacher to say, I wonder if this person might be on the autism spectrum. So if they're not speaking much by the age of 3, that's going to be a trigger point for us. That's a norm. All children that are typical will do some speaking by the age of 3. So that's something that comes from the work of Stanley Hall, this idea of age-related norms. And similar here, Gesell would say that maturation or growth occurs naturally and that's built into us, that we have a genetic sequence that determines, at least in part, how we develop. So he observed people using movie cameras, one-way mirrors. This is the early 20th century we're talking about here, 1920s, 1930s. And what's interesting is we still do that actually for developmental research, but also for training clinicians. We'll use one-way mirrors, we'll use taping, or not taping anymore, but digital recording, to assess whether someone is developing as a clinician. So pretty cool stuff here from Gesell. And so similar to what we saw from Hall in terms of norms, if we flip back to Gesell here, he was largely the inspiration for norm-referenced tests. So we may apply a test, we may administer a test to an individual, and then we take their score and we compare it to someone that's similar to them. So maybe somebody in their class or somebody of the same age, somebody with a similar diagnosis. And then we've got a normative population we can compare that individual score against. All right, so these were some of the developmental, scientific, philosophical theories, but what we're going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about is the lifespan perspective. And the idea with the lifespan perspective is that we tend to grow throughout life. So children and adults will experience major passages. There will be major life events that tend to shape who we are. And this theory, this perspective is important to take because people are living longer and longer. So as we have increased longevity, it's important to note, how are we changing over time? So, one of the things that we run into in America now is our problem with Social Security, that it's, set up to be bankrupt. We've got a bunch of baby boomers that are going to be tapping into Social Security soon, and not enough offspring from them and the offspring of their offspring to support it. So that's a problem, and that happened because Social Security was founded at a time when we weren't living nearly as long as we are now. So the average lifespan was shorter. So as we're living longer, it's important that we study people to see, how are we changing? How do our abilities change? What do we need to be planning for? Excuse me. So within this lifespan perspective, we've got Paul Baltes here, who talks about the multi-contextual nature of development. So meaning we have a lot of different influences on our development. And so there's a plasticity and adaptability at all ages, but it's going to look a little bit different. At some ages, it may be more of a brain level plasticity. It may be a behavioral plasticity at other times, an intellectual flexibility or plasticity. So his emphasis is that we change over time in different ways at different points in life. So with age then comes the need for strategies used to maximize gains and compensate for losses. So let's say our reaction time diminishes in old age, but maybe we have the ability to plan ahead better so that we don't need to react as quickly to a situation. So we're set up better. And then, of course, in terms of interdisciplinary perspectives, there are so many different fields that contribute to our understanding of people and human development. So psychology, sociology, medicine, just the general basic sciences, chemistry, physics, etc. These all have some bearing on human development. All right, so we're going to talk here about a few different domains or periods of development, and these come in three broad domain categories here. So physical, cognitive, and social here. So as we talk about these different periods of development here, we're going to get into some of the details of each of these, but you can see that really what we're talking about with lifespan development is truly from prenatal care, so from when we're still in the womb to late adulthood, preparing for passing on. All right, so before we jump into these, before we get a chance in the next several weeks here to talk about each of these different stages, time periods, and looking at each of the three broad domains of the physical, cognitive, and social areas in each of those periods, what do we know about each of these periods of development? So if we flip back here, what marks the end of each of these categories. So there will be some kind of milestone, some kind of step or stage or behavior, something that happens that marks the end of these. And it might be something like, learning to talk or graduating from a certain level of education. There might be something like having your own children. So these are some of the markers we might notice for different periods of development. All right. So let's take a look here at an example. So in terms of age differences in attainment of majority status. So basically, when are you an adult? And the reason I show you this here is to say that really there are things that are open to interpretation here in human development, and even within one country that has a lot of different subcultures to it, like the United States, there's really a lack of consensus about what constitutes a grown-up, what makes for an adult. So if we just look at the United States, you need parental permission to join the military until you get to age 18. You can drive a car at age 16 in most states. If you're going to be held accountable for, say, a murder charge, that starts at age 17, maybe 18, depending on the judge. To sign some kind of legal contract, like a contract for work without parental permission, you've got to be 18. Got to buy alcohol no earlier than 21 legally. And then this economic independence, like, when have you paid off your school loans, etc., is around 24 or so. And so we even see that with insurance companies saying, yeah, you can stay on your parents' insurance until this age as long as you're living at home, something like that. So we've even got this idea of emerging adulthood, and especially now where people are often returning home after college, sticking around for a lot longer within their parents' home, and if that is you, some different philosophies around this, but some people would say milk it for all you can, and save up so you have a shot at actually buying a home or paying off your loans or whatever it is that you'd like to do in the first few years after college. So take advantage of that. But then if we take a look at how the United States stacks up against some other countries in terms of when can you join the military, remember we said 18 is our age that we don't need parental permission anymore. So in Laos it's 15, the United Kingdom 16, 21 in Brazil, 22 in Afghanistan. So, you may have some stereotypes about some of these countries where you say, that doesn't really match up with what I would have thought. But, every country's going to have their own thoughts about when people become an adult or a grown-up, and there may be cultural pressures as to why that may or may not be for a particular country. All right, so development different for different countries. The body's going to grow pretty much the same, but in terms of cultural influences, we may mature in our non-physical ways differently based on what country or culture we come from. And so that starts to get into this idea of nature versus nurture. This is also sometimes called something else. We might think about it as environment versus genetics, heredity versus environment, something like that. So nature, this is really just getting at our biology. What are our inborn biases, our inborn propensities, or biological influences, versus nurture, or this environment where we're being influenced by our experiences. So we may have then experiences and we create an internal model of that experience that then directs our development. We've also got what your text calls a debate between continuity and discontinuity. So in terms of continuity, we've got quantitative change or change in the amount of some kind of growth. So how much can you walk or talk or think differently about things, versus discontinuity, where we've got more of a step-like change, where we're saying, okay, you're at this stage, or this stage, or this stage, or this stage, and then all of a sudden something happens and you're now this new stage, as opposed to continuity, where you're gradually building toward a new quote-unquote stage of development. So there's a debate about what these things may be. We'll look at some theorists this semester that talk about the way that they see human development happening, and so some of them will talk about stages of development. One of the first ones we'll talk about is Piaget and his stages of development. And one of the things we'll notice about Piaget is that really his stages that he laid out are actually a little more fluid than he thought. So we'll get a chance to look at those later on, but just know that there are these different ideas about how development happens. All right, so then we've got a few different types of change here. Not going to spend too much time on these here, but normative, age-graded, universal changes. So these just mean that as we grow, things just naturally happen. That there's some kind of internal biological or social clock that says at a certain point, this kind of change is going to happen. And then in terms of normative, history graded changes, again, normative meaning that happens for just about everybody. This means that within your particular cohort or age-related group or generational group, you'll have some changes that happen. So if you are from a generation that has never not had a cell phone in your pocket, past the age of 5. If you're from a generation where there was no microwave, these are different ways to grow up, and this is going to impact the way that you think about the world and think about things like time and how valuable is time. I always grew up with a microwave, but I didn't always grow up with a cell phone. So, the way that I think about the rapidity with which life must happen, right? How fast do things happen? My idea about pace may be a little different from my kids who try and pinch zoom on any screen that they come across, whether or not it's actually a touch screen, right? They just think differently about screens than I do. And so that's a cohort change. And then non-normative changes, these are things that are not specific to everyone, but they're things that may happen because of major life events. So these are unique changes for an individual. All right. I'll let you take a look at this, but this is just a study that takes a look at how your cohort that you're a part of, your age-related cohort, generational cohort, can change the way that you respond to a particular situation. So something like, in this case, the Great Depression. All right. So in terms of context for development, there are these concepts of vulnerability and resilience. So vulnerability, if we just take this common sense meaning, is that this is something that I am predisposed to be more at risk for a problem. So I'm vulnerable to a disease or to mental illness or not coping well. I'm vulnerable maybe because of something like poverty or genetics. And then we have protective factors that may lead to resilience. So both of these, vulnerability and resilience, tend to interact with your environment as a child. So the environment can cause differential effects, meaning different responses, but resilient children, so kids who are perhaps less vulnerable, but also those who have good support, have good coping skills, they can gain support from optimal environments. So when we think about these contexts here, it's not just that vulnerability and resilience, but gender actually can play a role here as well. And of course, society may have something to do with this, in terms of cultural influences and the messages that we tell boys and girls about what they're capable of, what they should expect from themselves, how they should treat themselves. But gender, and really one of the things we're thinking about here too, is sex. So biological sex can play a role in individual development and how we respond to things, the toys that we have a preference for, our emotional responses to stressful situations. These are all different just based on our biological sex, not even gender, which is more of a socially constructed term here. So the interaction between our personal characteristics and our environmental influences is also influenced by gender. So if we take the example of delinquency, we've got, say, a teenager who's getting in trouble frequently at school, truancy. They've gone to juvenile hall. They've got a social worker that's involved regularly in their life. This this model here shows us that delinquency is influenced by all of these other factors. So maybe we've got, in terms of parenting, poor discipline and monitoring. And we've got the personal factor of just a generally non-compliant child. So they're pushing people's buttons. So negative behavior patterns get established. They may be getting rejected by peers and their school community, maybe by their teachers. So this pushes them further toward delinquency. And then they're more difficult to manage. So poor discipline at home. And the loop goes on. So this is a context for development that's really important to show us it's not just one factor that's playing a role here in delinquency. All right, so we get the idea here, I think, of context. And in terms of timing, there are some types of context that are important to think about here. So we've got critical periods and sensitive periods. All right, so a critical period and a sensitive period, these are very similar concepts here, related concepts. So a critical period is going to be a pretty narrow window in which an individual, an organism is very sensitive to a particular kind of experience and needs to perhaps respond to that experience or develop some kind of new skill or behavior in that period of time. So it may be that there's a critical period for imprinting in animals, or perhaps for a particular kind of language development in humans. So, for example, learning particular sounds and language, the 6 to 8 months old age range is a critical period for that. So if you don't get it during that age period, it's never going to be, you can never get that same level of connection to the language. So that's a critical period there. Then a sensitive period is similar, but it's often a bit bigger, maybe in terms of months, maybe even years, but where you're particularly sensitive to things maybe like attachment bonding with your primary caregiver. And then the idea with on-time events, this is where versus off-time events, where you've had some kind of experience, some kind of life event at a time that's pretty typical for most people in your culture and your society. So if you have your first marriage sometime between the age of 20 and 40, that's more typical in America than if you had your first marriage at 68. So that would be an off-time event. So these things can be influential for a person in that if you have an on-time event, then you're perhaps going to be more accepted. You'll feel a little bit better about yourself. People will treat you as though you're typical. But if you have an off-time event, then you may be rejected. You may it may be a sign of pathology, either biological or social pathology, but you may be thought of a little bit differently. And then we've got atypical development, and that really is where we're thinking about more psychopathology. So we're thinking about people that are far enough outside of the norms for their society that it's really not healthy for them or the people around them. And so then we've got what we call the double whammy. And the double whammy is where we get a child who is vulnerable. So again, we've got some of those risk factors, maybe they're poor, maybe they have poor coping skills, poor genetics, poor parenting, and then we put them into a poor environment. So a vulnerable child in a poor environment, maybe a really rough neighborhood, parents that aren't around, bad schooling, gangs, we put a vulnerable child into a bad situation and they've got the double whammy. So they're likely going to be in trouble without some kind of intervention. So these are the contexts of development that can influence how we go about developing. All right, so let's now shift gears a little bit and let's talk about no longer just the context of development in the big picture, but how do we actually study development? How do we know whether something is an on-time event or an off-time event, whether something's typical or not? Well, that happens through the scientific process, and so you've likely experienced this through a biology class in high school or in college, some kind of other science class. Maybe you've taken a research methods course, and so what we're going to do in the next few minutes here as we talk through the rest of chapter 1 is we're going to take a look at developmental science as a process. So the goals here, we want to describe development, we want to explain it, so thinking about the whys, why does something happen the way it does, and then ultimately we need to be able to do two things: predict what might happen, predict developmental events, and then have some kind of influence on outcomes. So if we say, I know that when this event happens and it's combined with a child with XYZ abilities or vulnerabilities, that this outcome is likely to happen. So if we can predict what's going to happen, there's a good chance we might actually be able to intervene and change that outcome. So one of the first things we are going to run across in any kind of research is either a theory or hypothesis or prediction. And so I was doing a little 4-year-old science experiments with my little guy today, and got a 4-year-old and an almost 2-year-old. And so the 2-year-old, not so much ready for science experiments, but the 4-year-old, he's starting to get curious. So I explained to him what a hypothesis is today, and I said it's a guess. It's a guess about what you think might happen. So this is different from a theory in that a theory is a set of statements that puts out a proposal about a general set of principles about how or why things happen. So a theory is a guess about how and why things happen. That's kind of a more formal proposal. Hypothesis really is just an educated guess that is testable. So it has to be put forth in a testable fashion so that we can apply the rest of the research process. So in terms of describing human development, descriptive methods, we're going to run into things that we're going to call variables. And these are just characteristics or things that can vary across people and actually also across situations as well. That'll be important to think about. And then we're going to have relationships between variables. So when two or more variables vary together, they co-vary. So we're going to call that a correlation, that there's some kind of relationship between these variables. So what might be some variables that we might want to study to learn about our class? Variables might be things that describe the students. So the age of the students, or what is the year in school? Are you guys in a relationship or not? These are things that might help us understand you as a class body. But then if we started adding outside variables in here, and we might be able to predict something. So we might look at past GPA and whether or not you have children, and that might kind of help us predict what your grade is going to be in this class. So if you have a lower GPA and multiple children in your life, there's a good chance that this is going to be a tough experience for you. Just school in general is difficult by itself, and let alone when you have other people that are depending on you, right? So we might, unless you are very well equipped and very dedicated and have a lot of support, it would be hard for you to be top of the class, right? So now that's not to say that would never happen, but in terms of a correlational relationship, not causal, but correlational, just moving together, people that have a more difficult life circumstance, we might expect them to have a more difficult time in school. So those are just variables, and again, we can't say for sure one way or another what would happen with that, but we could make some guesses or hypotheses that we could test out by gathering some data on the class. So there are several ways that we can study people in terms of descriptive methods. And the first here is naturalistic observations. And these are just observing people in their natural or normal environment. And this can be a problem if we haven't defined our terms really well, if we have observers that are biased and maybe are invested in something or tend to see a behavior differently than other people. It's also very time consuming, and we can't generalize it because, at least to most people, because it's in such a limited environment that we're doing the observation a lot of times. We also run into case studies a lot of times, and these are in-depth examinations of individual cases. And the problem with this is that as much as they're interesting and we might say, wow, that was a fascinating case study, it doesn't help me understand most other people in the world because it's so specific. And this is different from laboratory observations where we've got a situation that's not like real life, really. So it doesn't have that realism of a daily experience like a naturalistic observation. But it is controlled, and because it's controlled, we might be able to make better predictions from it, or we might be able to be more precise about our outcomes, how we describe those outcomes. And then we've got some survey methods where we can either hand out questionnaires, we can email these, we can mail these to people, and then we can actually sit down and do an interview with someone, either over the phone, over the internet, or over just in person, right? So kind of the good old-fashioned sit down and talk with somebody. So these are surveys, and we can gather basic information from people. So the methods here, we're asking questions and we record the answers, and this is actually a very laborious process, so it's very time consuming. We call this qualitative research. And when we start getting into surveys and questionnaires and interviews, we have to end up using what we call a sample, and a sample is just a selected subset of a population, where the population is the broadest group that we're hoping that our research will apply to. So we're going to have a sample that we use to understand a broader population. All right. Correlations. I mentioned this earlier, and very briefly, a correlation just describes the strength and direction of a relationship between two variables. So not just the strength, but also the direction. So it can go from a negative 1.00 to a positive 1.00. A negative correlation means that scores on the variables move in opposite directions. So, we might say something like number of children that you have and hours of sleep that you get in a night. So the more children you have, the less sleep you're going to get, something like that. And then we might have a positive correlation. So high scores on one variable usually mean a high score on the other, and vice versa. Low scores on one, low scores on the other. So, let's see. So we might say like high scores on the SAT might be correlated with high scores in on freshman GPA. And this actually is true. There's plenty of research that backs that up. So that would be a positive correlation. All right. So one thing to bear in mind here is that correlation does not mean causality. So just because things tend to shift together doesn't mean that one causes the other. And you'll see the word prove here, and I just want you to get that out of your vocabulary. Don't use the word prove anymore. Try to never say the word prove. Say things like, the data lend support to this idea, something like that. But just remember, anytime you see a correlation, it just means, we might be better at predicting something because it does tend to vary with this other thing that we're looking at. But there's nothing causal that's been proven here. The problem here is that just because two things move together, there may be something else that's mediating that outcome. So there may be a third or fourth or fifth variable. There may be several variables that are influencing the variation in the second variable, the change in the second variable. All right. In terms of experimental designs, these are things that allow us to say that something caused something else. So if we have a hypothesis about this causes changes in this, we can actually test that out and find support for the causality there through doing what we call an experiment, where we take more than one group and we compare those groups, and we've manipulated a variable. So the variables we're going to manipulate are independent variables and dependent variables. So independent variables, these are things that we manipulate. So this might be an environment, it might be a situation. It could be something like, are you getting a treatment or a pill? It could be, are you in a classroom or in a park? So it could be the environment. And the dependent variable, this is the thing where we're trying to see, is there a change in this variable based on a change in the other variable? So the independent variable causes the effect in the dependent variable. And so that's an experiment. Now, a quasi-experiment, this is where we're doing the same thing we did before with the change in the independent to see whether there's an effect on the dependent variable. But a quasi-experiment means that we haven't been able to randomly assign people to groups. So let's say you're trying to study something in a school setting, you're interested in something developmental that happens in, say, third grade, around age 8, something like that. But you can't randomly assign kids to classrooms. They're already in their classrooms. So when you're studying it, you can't randomly assign them. So even though you've done what you could to make it an experimental design, it's quasi-experimental because you can't randomly assign kids to groups. All right, so let's take a look at a few different designs that help us in terms of a lifespan perspective to take a more detailed look at people across that lifespan. So cross-sectional, longitudinal, and sequential. So cross-sectional designs, this is where we're doing basically one-time measurement of something, but we still want to see what's happening across the lifespan. So we may take people from multiple different age groups and study them all at the same time. So this might help us to understand whether there's an age difference in a particular variable. But the problem here is that sometimes those differences we see amongst the participants at different ages may actually not be age differences, but more cohort or generational effects. So it might be that, 65-year-olds that were born in the 50s are different from 65-year-olds that were born in the 30s. But all we know is that they're 65 years old. So we're trying to make a prediction about what happens when you're 65 years old based on just one single generation, when really it'd be more helpful to have multiple generations of 65-year-olds. So that was cross-sectional, and we just described this problem with birth cohort or generational effects, where we might see those two things get mixed up together when we're trying to make a prediction, and we really shouldn't be doing that because we've got some kind of cohort effect going. So if we take a look at this here, do you see any kind of cohort pattern here? Anything? And this is the ability to recognize feelings on a stimulus face. So hopefully, as you pause here, you'll pause the recording here and take a look and see, is there anything that stands out to you? And as you do that, you may notice that the best in just about each group here, maybe with the exception here of fear, that the best at recognition at each particular feeling is the under 40s crowd. So the under 40s tend to be the best at recognizing affect. And so then, we've got kind of mixed findings here, kind of back and forth between the blues and the greens for different affects here. And then, so that tells us maybe just at a first glance, we can't make much of a distinction between over 40s. But under 40s, we can say these people are relatively good at recognizing affect. So one of the things you might think about here is this a cohort pattern here? So who's our cohort? Well, we've got our age groups, but then we might also want to say, okay, what's happening for people at these age ranges? So if we look at fear, the 40 to 60-year-olds, what was happening for them? Well, were more of them involved in, say, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, something like that? Yes. And so maybe we've got more people here than we might have in the under 40 crowd, where fewer of them have been involved in wars. So that's where we start to have to get into more detail, a greater level of detail when we're doing our data analysis. All right, so then longitudinal designs. These get costly in terms of time and money because we're looking at people and studying the same group over a long period of time. So we can see, is there a change in the data over time with these same people? So we can see consistencies and inconsistencies in the data based on individual differences. And then what we can do is we can compare change in that same person over time. Now, some problems with this, we're using the same measurement multiple times to see if there are changes in that measurement. So they may get what's called the practice effect. So if we're looking at IQ change over time, you might get familiar with the test and do better just because time has passed. Just because you've had some practice. And then, of course, study attrition. If you start with 1,000 people in your cohort and you're trying to study people for 20 years, some of those people are going to die, some of them are going to move, some of them will have changed phone numbers 7 times and you can't get in touch with them. They've changed their email, they haven't done the call forwarding. So you're going to lose some of your people. So that's unfortunate. So this is just an example of a longitudinal design here where we can see changes that happen for the same group over time. And so we notice that a self-confidence score, I couldn't tell you what the score goes up to, but we can see that there is a change here over time, and that men and women tend to be relatively similar kind of in their adulthood years up until about the mid-40s. And so you hit middle age and men tend to have confidence increase, and perhaps that's because traditionally men have been placed more into managerial roles, their careers are booming, whereas there's been a bit of a ceiling for women throughout a lot of American history in terms of their business capabilities, not capabilities, but what they've been, what's been offered to women. So we may see this change if this study were to be done in another 20 years, and hopefully we would see that. But we can see that there are some age-related differences here. So next we've got sequential designs. So this is a combined approach where we're taking groups from at least 2 cohorts and we're following them in a longitudinal study. So we might take 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds and say, okay, so we've got a couple different cohorts here. We're going to follow them over time. Maybe we want 20-year-olds and 50-year-olds. So we've got people from 2 very disparate groups here, but we're going to follow both groups over time and see how much is their change due just to time, how much might it be due to cohort effects. So we get to see both happen here, and it just gives us more information, better information. So this would be an example of that cross sequential design here, where we've got a couple different cohorts where we've got pre-baby boomers and then the actual baby boomers, and we can look at how do women in these groups perceive their femininity over time, and then how do they perceive marital conflict? Do they tend to see marital conflict a lot? And so we see that for femininity, really no differences here. But then on this next variable here of perceptions of marital conflict, a big difference between the pre-boomers and the baby boomers. So that's where it's helpful to study people over time. So across a couple of decades here, following people for 20 years. And these women had some differences of opinion here, or perception, depending on the variable that you ask them about. So then cross-cultural research. This is important because we tend to get stuck in our own bubbles here, and it's really easy to do because funding is scarce, and just, a lot of researchers don't have a ton of time to be putting together and executing their studies, so they may just do the simplest thing and work with whomever is in front of them, which limits their study. Now, ethnographic research involves a researcher going and typically living amongst the people of a particular culture, and they stay there for months, even years sometimes, to do a really in-depth analysis of that culture. So it provides descriptive information, typically very in detail or in-depth descriptive information, and then they're often able to make some kinds of interpretive remarks about that. Cross-cultural studies, these are different. So ethnographic research is looking at one culture, and then cross-cultural research is trying to determine, are there differences or similarities amongst cultural groups. So this, in terms of human development research, this is helpful because we want to know if we see something in one culture, is this universal? Is this something that happens for everyone? And if not, why? Is it due to genetics? Is it due to culture? Some kind of combination of these things? And we can only learn that through cross-cultural research. So the last thing we'll talk about from chapter 1 here is ethics. And essentially, we always want to think of two things when we're considering ethics here. We want to, first and foremost, protect people, protect animals, just protecting our subjects. And we do this in part through institutional review boards. We have a couple of these at CBU, and there are also broader governing bodies we have to think about, like the American Psychological Association, that has rules around research that we should consider. So we always want to think protection here, but when it comes to protecting animal rights, we sometimes will step over the line and do some things that seem unethical if, and this is the big if the study has been determined to have scientific value that justifies the harm that would be inflicted. So, for instance, my wife, when she was an undergraduate, she was doing some research with mice, and they would need to euthanize the mice when they were done. But they would do this as humanely as possible by first putting the mouse into a carbon dioxide chamber and suffocating it, and then pithing the mouse's brain, just to ensure that it had died, that it's not going to suffer. And they do it in that specific order to avoid as much suffering as possible. And that got approved through the school's IRB that she was at. And they deemed that the scientific value was worth the sacrifice of those mice. So, those types of things, it hits on both things we want to think about, is what's the value of the research, but then also how best can we protect our subjects, whether they're human or not. So really the primary things we want to consider here: protection from harm for all of our subjects, informed consent whenever that's possible. If we're going to use deception, then we can't really give them informed consent about that, but we only use deception if it's absolutely necessary, and then we have to debrief them right afterward. Then we have to ensure that there's confidentiality of the results and participation. So we'll typically assign a research participant either a pseudonym or a number. And that's all they are from that point in the study on. And the knowledge of the results. So participants in research studies are often promised a copy of the paper when it comes out, or at least a copy of the results. All right, so that is all for chapter 1 here. We're going to do a separate posting for chapters 2 and 3. But this one went a little long because we had a lot to cover in terms of getting you introduced to the field of human development. So thanks for sticking with, and look forward to chapters 2 and 3 coming soon.